I have the pleasure at this point of introducing our next keynote speaker, Dominic Giroux. Dominic Giroux has been serving as Laurentian University's 10th president since April of 2009. His first 5-year term was renewed unanimously by the Board of Governors for another 5 years, ending in June of 2019. In 2011, he received one of Canada's top 40 under 40 awards. Under his leadership, Laurentian launched a focused 2012 to 2017 strategic plan endorsed in a Globe and Mail editorial as an excellent strategy. Mr. Giroux started in education as a school board trustee, get this, at 19. He was board chair at 21 in Ottawa. Prior to his appointment at Laurentian in 2009, he was Assistant Deputy Minister with the Ontario Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities, after having served as CFO of 2 French language school boards in Southern and Eastern Ontario. Mr. Giroux currently serves on the Executive Committee of both Universities Canada and the Ontario Council of Universities, on Ontario's Economic Advisory Panel, Hydro One's Customer Service Advisory Panel, the Mowat Centre's Advisory Board, and the boards of Canadian Accredited Independent Schools and the Greater Sudbury Food Bank. He served in 2011 to 2012 as one of 4 members of the Commission on Reform of Ontario's Public Services, chaired by Don Drummond, tasked to recommend to the government how to deliver the most efficient public services possible. He also served as co-special advisor on the implementation of Northern Policy Institute and was appointed to the province's Ring of Fire Advisory Council and the Globe and Mail's Advisory Board on Higher Education. He co-chaired the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer and the Consortium National de Formation en Santé, chaired the board of the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and the Centre for Excellence in Mining Innovation, and served as vice chair of the Association des Universités de la Francophonie Canadienne and the Association Canadienne Française de l'Ontario d'Ottawa. He also served on the boards of the Greater Sudbury Development Corporation, the Canadian Education Association, the Education Quality and Accountability Office, and Montfort Hospital. A member of the Ontario College of Teachers, Mr. Giroux holds a bachelor's degree in social sciences and education from the University of Ottawa, as well as an MBA from the École des Hautes Études Commerciales in Montreal. The University of Ottawa gave him the Leadership in Education Award in 2007, while HEC gave him a Talented Young Manager Award in the Large Business category in 2008. He was named the 2010 Education Personality of the Year by Radio-Canada Le Droit and received a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, a Paul Harris Fellowship from the Rotary Club, and a Community Builders Award of Excellence in Sudbury. With that, let me introduce Dominic Giroux.
Sorry about that. I think the introduction could have just said, please welcome Dominic. Ani Bojo Kwekwe, Mami Kwendam Jiwik Miek. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Piton First Nation, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas at the Credit River. C'est vraiment un privilège pour moi de me retrouver en terrain familier ici ce matin. Yes, I will be speaking both English and French, so I would encourage you to please wear your headsets for simultaneous translation. C'est vraiment un plaisir donc pour moi d'être ici ce matin, de me retrouver avec plusieurs anciens collègues, des amis. I realized this morning that you can be in K-12 for 15 years and you can run, but you can't hide. And it's a delight for me to be here this morning. And I was asked to share some personal reflections on my experience as chair of various boards, as now as president of Laurentian University, with a focus on what I feel are the most critical components for success. So I'm hoping not to take the full hour, because I'd like to have time for meaningful dialogue before lunch, and I do realize that I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch, and I don't want to abuse that. Now, unlike Dr. Bart, I absolutely do not claim to be an expert on governance. In fact, over the weekend, I was looking up some definitions of what an expert is. Someone who thinks they know how to do something, but actually just screwed everything up. Yep. Now, please don't say this, yes, Dominic, you screwed up in the past. As someone who goes into a serious explanation of doing something fairly simple or unimportant, like how to drive a bumper car. And also an expert is when you do something, when something just doesn't work how you want it to do. So in preparing my remarks this morning, I actually did a bit of crowdsourcing using social media, and I encourage you during the session, if you are on Twitter, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn, to tweet about the session and what you agree with and don't agree with and so forth. So I actually posted on Facebook and Twitter a comment saying, I am presenting on Tuesday morning to all the chairs and vice chairs and directors of education, what should I say about governance? So let me just share with you some of the advice I got from some of your colleagues. So I had one colleague because just so you know, I have 10,000 followers on social media, and these are my personal accounts. These are not managed by our marketing department. No one is my password. So here's some of the input I got. The foundation of best governance is trust built and nurtured at every level. A former trustee wrote, governance must serve to empower those that can make a difference in others' lives and not to limit new ideas and differences in approaches. And I would note that trustee served only one term. Footnote. The head of Canadian Accredited Independent Schools wrote, look at preparing students for the future, such as the 2051 project strands and students' feedback, which is an initiative of CASE. The former president of the Council of Ontario University tweeted, always ask the key question, does this help with student success, whether budget, policy, new program, or expenditure? A parent wrote, governance must connect schools, parents, and communities. Un parent m'a écrit en français sur Facebook que les systèmes et sous-systèmes sont en synergie pour promouvoir les besoins de la communauté, les étudiants et les parents. Un ancien collègue au conseil scolaire du Centre-Est à Ottawa m'a écrit il doit y avoir un leadership fort du conseil sur les grands résultats à atteindre selon les parents et la communauté. C'est un devoir fiduciaire de développer la mission et la vision. Il doit y avoir une délégation d'attente claire à la direction générale, une confiance dans la direction générale et l'administration pour livrer la marchandise. Il doit y avoir un focus et un alignement de haut en bas sur les grosses ce qui est écrit sur les grosses roches, donc je veux dire sur les enjeux importants. Il doit y avoir une évaluation rigoureuse et périodique des progrès et il doit y avoir célébration des succès. Le directeur général de l'AFO, Peter Uminock, m'a écrit « Voyons, Dominique, ce qui est important, c'est la gestion par et pour les francophones. C'est important que la gouvernance reflète l'institution et les étudiants, mais je suis certain que tu connais déjà ça. » Robert Pilon, ancien directeur de l'éducation du CEPOC à Ottawa, m'a écrit sur Facebook « Tu dois te placer dans le contexte de ta participation à un atelier que j'avais donné en 1997, imaginez-vous donc, aux futures directions de l'éducation pour le Centre Leadership et parler de tes expériences d'ancien président de conseil, tout en ajoutant ton expérience des dernières années, ton cheminement, un peu l'approche de connaissances, d'expérience et de vision. Michael Belmore, trustee from Sudbury, and I saw Michael here at the back, wrote, I actually look forward to hearing that keynote, proud that an educational leader from Sudbury is delivering it. My favorite, though, and that's the last one, from a diplomat in Spain who wrote, never thought of crowdsourcing my speeches, curious as to what that might look like. So as indicated in that very long intro, I served as a trustee at age 19. I'll tell you, in retrospect, I was a lousy trustee in my first year. The micromanager, in the weeds, in the kitchen, under the sink type of trustee. And I realized after 1 year that that was not working. So by the second year, I thought I became a really darn good trustee because I understood that policy was my friend. And I guess I did a reasonable good job because in my third year, I won the beauty competition to become the chair of the board. And there's a comment here on my slide about the grass is not always greener on the other side. After that experience, I was fortunate to be recruited by the French Catholic School Board here in central southwestern Ontario, and Marcel Lévesque, who's here, was on my recruiting committee, who gambled at 24 to hire me as senior business official for that board. I hope you've improved your judgment since then, Marcel. And when I thought, geez, that's a startup, creation of new French boards and so forth, and then I moved back to Ottawa to my former board. So yes, I was on the other side now, answering the questions to the trustees as opposed to asking the probing questions to senior administration. Had the privilege to work with Joanne Lacombe there at the school board. And at that school board, unlike it wasn't a startup, it was really about understanding the challenges of meeting growth needs in the suburbs while making tough decisions in inner city cores. I've seen directors of education leave prematurely. I've seen all superintendents resign in a board after the hiring of a director of education. Now, thinking about going to the other side, I was fortunate to work as ADM in the ministry, and then I thought, I'm going to show the ministry how it really works, until I realized that there was totally a whole new world out there, that half of the role of people like George and Bruce and company is to deal with the other side, other ministries, government, the Pink Palace, political staff here at Queen's Park. But what George was saying this morning is so true. That's where I discovered that it only takes one board to screw it up and force changes system-wide. Now, speaking of the grass being greener on the other side, the most challenging experience I've had in governance is the current one, chairing a university senate. So, dear directors of education, when you're really frustrated about a tough board meeting with your 12 or 22 trustees at TDSB, imagine chairing a senate with 80 people, the majority of which are unionized members of your faculty, and you have students and alumni and so forth. And your own renewal as president and the renewal of your vice presidents and of your deans is subject to a vote of your unionized members 3 to 5 years from now. That's fun. It really keeps you on your toes. But the greatest learning experience for me, though, was going back to that first experience as trustee from 94 to 97. So please raise your hand if you were a trustee in 97. Wow. Congratulations, you survived 97. You should proudly wear a t-shirt. Please raise your hand if you were a director of education or a supervisory officer in 97. Martha, and a few others. So for those who don't remember 97, this was the year of the Fewer School Boards Act, Bill 104, where education was removed from residential property tax base. New funding model. English school boards merged from about 124 to 60. 12 French new boards created. Number of trustees down from 1,900 to 700. Pay was reduced significantly, in some cases from 40,000 to 5,000. School councils were made mandatory. New curriculum introduced. Principals were brought outside of the bargaining unit. EQO was created a few months before. So was the Ontario College of Teachers. And the minister was saying that to drive change, you needed to create a crisis. It felt a bit like this. Et je pense quand on retourne en arrière, évidemment, on peut avoir des frustrations. Je suis certain que vous avez des frustrations présentement, je pense surtout aux élus, face au rôle du conseil, aux relations avec le ministère, aux attentes élevées des parents. Il faut quand même se rappeler qu'il y a eu des temps beaucoup plus difficiles, à mon avis, au niveau de l'éducation élémentaire et secondaire. Donc, en gros, ce que j'aimerais aborder ce matin, c'est quelques leçons apprises qui, à mon avis, peuvent contribuer à votre succès. J'en ai à peu près une trentaine, je les ai résumées en 7 catégories. Et je vais également parler brièvement de stratégie organisationnelle, de ce sur quoi je pense le conseil devrait s'attarder. Aussi réfléchir à comment votre conseil et chacun de nos conseils peut être le meilleur qu'il soit. Et je vais conclure avec quelques pensées provocatrices vers la fin, avec 7 ans de recul d'éducation élémentaire secondaire. Je pense que je peux me permettre de faire ça. Unfortunately, I don't have a book to sell, but I do have a university to sell, so I will do a quick infomercial about Laurentian University and then wrap up with a few key takeaways. Alors, les 7 catégories que j'ai retenues qui, à mon avis, peuvent contribuer au succès de la gouvernance d'un conseil scolaire, d'abord, j'ai mis en premier lieu le développement des relations. And the reason I put relationship building as the first category of critical components for success is that my small nuance that I will share with you this morning from what you just heard from Dr. Bart is that school boards, at the end of the day, are governed by elected officials. And that relationship building part is key and, in my view, quite unique to other forms of governance. But other themes that I will speak very briefly also is about, I think, trustees, chairs and vice chairs and directors also need to be mindful of how to take care of themselves as leaders of their organization, to reflect on what your board discusses during its meetings, the approach to your meetings, approach to board committees, that CEO-director relationship. I'll spend a bit more of time having been both as a senior executive and as a school board chair. If you've read Jim Collins' From Good to Great, it's really about picking who's on the bus and then the what you want to accomplish, and then speak about a development and multi-year plan. So about relationship building, I remember in 1999 when I was at the Conseil catholique du Centre-Sud holding a retreat of my senior leadership team, and we were reflecting on how we were working 22 hours a day, I think at the time, Marcel, and we still were not getting the job done in meeting all the expectations from trustees. And a consultant that we was facilitating our discussion shared this model with us. And she said, you're all focused on the results, but at the end of the day, the foundation you need to work on as leaders in your school board, with your staff and with your communities, is that relationship building piece. And only if that foundation is really strong will you be successful in identifying all the possibilities, selecting the opportunities, taking action, and delivering on those results. And looking back, when I reflect on the opportunities that were the most successful in my 20 years in education, it's where those efforts of relationship building were intentional, that we together determined that we really need to do a good job around this. And it's also understanding that we deal in school boards and in our communities with evolving coalition of interests, and that those interests evolve over time. I remember in 2007 speaking at the OSP Labor Relations Symposium, and I think Bob Williams came to the mic and said, so Dominic, how do you think it's going to go with the next round of labor relations? And I remember answering, it depends. It depends on who's elected in terms of government, depends on who's elected in terms of the executive of each of the trustee associations, it depends on who's on code and so forth. And I think accepting that those coalitions of interest evolve and shape the discourse is quite important. And when you reflect on the importance of those relationships, let's think about when we have positive relationships. when we are in a positive relationship with someone, I would suggest there's usually three things that characterize that relationship. Number one, you feel respected as an individual or as an organization. Number two, the person or the body you're dealing with is reliable. They deliver the goods. They honor their word. And the third one is that they have the skill set to do what's expected of them. So I would just encourage you to think in your role as chairs and vice chair, how you build those strong relationships for your board and the communities that you serve. Maintenant, bien que c'est vrai que les relations sont importantes et le focus sur le résultat est important, je pense que la différence dans un conseil scolaire, puisque le conseil scolaire est gouverné par des élus, c'est que vous vous trouvez dans une situation où vous posez des questions au cadre supérieur. Et souvent, la question que vous posez, ça doit être limité en 20 secondes, 30 secondes. Et la personne à qui vous posez la question, la direction de l'éducation, idéalement, ou une surintendance, adopte des croyances ou adopte des hypothèses face aux motifs qui vous invitent à poser une question. Et quand je pense à ma première année surtout, parce que j'étais un très mauvais conseiller scolaire, je ne prenais jamais la peine d'articuler quelle était la valeur ou l'hypothèse que je faisais. Et inévitablement, les cadres supérieurs et la direction de l'éducation faisaient leur propre hypothèse sur ce qui m'amenait à soulever un point. Et c'est ce manque de communication-là qui faisait en sorte qu'on n'était pas aussi efficace. Alors, je pense que c'est important comme élu et comme direction de l'éducation de réfléchir au fait que nos croyances, c'est-à-dire, oui, il y a un focus sur les résultats, mais les résultats que vous atteignez comme conseil scolaire viennent renforcer vos croyances, vos valeurs, vos jugements, les interprétations, les hypothèses que vous faites. Et dans le fond, ces croyances-là vont venir influencer vos comportements comme élus et les comportements des autres conseillers et conseillers scolaires. Et ces comportements-là, justement, vont influencer les relations que vous développez au sein de vos conseils scolaires. Et ces relations-là, comme je disais tout à l'heure, vont avoir un impact déterminant sur le résultat que vous allez atteindre. Now, why do I think it's important for trustees and chairs and vice chairs and directors to be taking care of self? I know things have improved lately with support of trustee associations in the ministry, but I think we do a really bad job generally in terms of orientation for new trustees and for new directors of education. I remember my orientation as a trustee. The senior team of the board did a great job of telling me everything that was about operations. They invited me in the kitchen and under the sink, as opposed to talking about the strategic imperatives, the trends, what I should be paying attention, what was keeping them at night. And same for directors of education. It is lonely at the top. And as much as we can take programs for SOs and so forth, nothing really prepares you for that moment where you're ultimately accountable to a board of trustees. I also think it's important for boards and directors to reflect on the value of quick wins. So for directors, you need to position your politicians for an immediate success after the election. And vice versa, if you're a board and you're hiring your new director of education and you're about to do cool stuff, why don't you keep a few good announceables for the new director of education? That helps set the tone for your organization. I also think it's important to ensure feedback loops. Our former chair at Laurentian University, Floyd Loughran, a former deputy premier, was adamant that we do regular written feedback among governors. Our board has 25 voting governors. So I feel the pain for TDSB. And that was very effective. And also we make sure that I provide written feedback to the board about their performance, and obviously they conduct my performance review annually. One of the great things about being university president is to meet a lot of donors and donor prospects and some of the most brilliant minds in the country. And in the first few weeks in my role, I met with Warren Holmes, who's a now retired mining executive. And I was all excited over breakfast at the King Eddie Hotel here to tell him about everything about Laurentian and my plans and what we're doing. And after 10 minutes, I could see that he was not really paying attention anymore. And I asked him, so what's on your mind? Any advice for me? And he just stared down at me and said, how are you going to stay fresh as CEO? And I thought, well, actually, I took my shower this morning. Everything's fine. But his point to me was, you're smart, you're good, you're effective, you've been chosen, you'll do a great job. But how will you really distinguish yourself? How will you stay sharp? And how will your board stay sharp? And that always stayed with me, and I think it's something we all need to reflect on. Now, the third category, I think, of lessons learned around governance is what the board discusses and chooses to focus on. One of the things that used to happen when I was a trustee that drove me nuts was we were in a French Catholic system. The part that drove me nuts was not the fact we were doing a prayer at the beginning of each board meeting. What drove me nuts is that one of the trustees would always do the same prayer. And dear Lord, please help us to make the best decisions, for the interest of the kids. And I remember thinking and being, frustrated during debates where trustees would say, well, I'm voting this way because it's the right thing to do for the kids. Please raise your hand if you're not here for the good of the kids. So as chair, whenever a trustee would say this, I would say, hold on, name the issue. Have the courage of your conviction. Don't use the kids as a scapegoat, because quite frankly, you can vote in favor or against the school closure, and you can absolutely spin it as being good for the kids. I think the challenge you have also as elected officials and as directors of education is to focus on what matters and focus not as much on the distractors. When I chaired the board in Ottawa, I remember facing school closures, 400 angry parents in the boardroom, and a parent who was the mother of one of my former girlfriends coming to the board meeting and just blasting me in public, doing personal attacks. And here I thought this meeting is going to go down the drain, and the media is in the room and so forth. And the acting director of education, Pierre Fiatro, just after the presentation whispered to me, not realizing his mic was opened, Dominic, don't enter in the pissing contest with a skunk. What Pierre was telling me in his North Bay way was focus on what matters, which is the decision being made, not the distractors. George and I had a deputy minister who would run his weekly meetings with a one-pager. The A list, the B list, and the distractors. Yes, some of your boards were on the distractors list. But it was to keep us focused on what really mattered, and I think that's definitely something I learned along the way. The other learning was that I think it's real, and I didn't share that view a few years ago, and I started sharing that view 2-3 years ago. But I think it's important for directors of education to make their strategic problems the board's problem and the stakeholders' problem. I was not of that view until 3 years ago. My sense was I'm the CEO, I'm expected to run the shop, not bother the board with what's on my mind and so forth. But I look back at an opportunity in '98, for example, when the French Catholic School Board in Ottawa closed 25 schools in 4 months, believe it or not, without one single letter of complaint to the minister. And the headline of the Ottawa Citizen the next morning was French Catholic Board implements strategy for the 21st century. What that Board of Trustees did, and what the Director of Education, the staff of that board did, was make the sustainability of the board's problem. And instead of pitting one community against the other, believe it or not, the trustees passed 51 motions indicating their intention to close every school of the board. So everyone was in it together, and with 3 parents from each school, with facilitators during a 4-month period, came up with a strategy to close 25 schools. I think it's important to keep that focus on outcomes, to keep the focus on the next 15 years. I think trying to have a focus on more than 15 years is la-la land. But 15 years, that means it's the students applying to full-day kindergarten when they'll be graduating. I remember my speech as chair, in my inaugural meeting as chair of the board in Ottawa, was precisely that. Here's what I'm hoping we can do for the students who are coming in junior kindergarten within the board. I've also learned along the way that policy and process is your friend. In my first year as trustee, we had delegations after delegations after delegations on busing. Do you still have those? And we had a 17-page busing policy. And parents would come about, I don't want to cross this 2-lane street and 4-lane street, and that bus stop is not safe. And just parent after parent after parent, Stephen Taylor, our transportation director, would just be answering the questions. And then my second year, that's where I started understanding the policy is your friend, and that our job was not to be in the kitchen under the sink. I looked at Stephen and said, couldn't we just pass a policy that said safety is important to us? We can't go over budget on busing. Younger kids should have priority for spots in the buses. We should share with the co-terminus school boards. We need to take care of special education needs. Yeah, we could do that. And that's the policy that the board approved in '97. We never talked about busing again because we empowered the director of education. So we really discovered there that policy was our friend. One thing that I learned as a so let me see. Oops, I need to go back. Now, and I just realized I was just skip a slide here. Just two quick things in terms of focus on what the board discusses. I think it's imperative that school boards be bold, ambitious, and driven. I'm not just saying this because it's our slogan at Laurentian University. First infomercial. We want, as Ontarians, we want the 72 school boards to be outstanding school boards. So I really encourage you to dream big. And one thing I learned early on from Pierre Marcil, who unfortunately passed away recently, who was Director of Education at the French Catholic Board in Ottawa, was please budget a plan as opposed to planning a budget. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, approaches to meetings. Chris spoke a little bit about this, so I'll go more quickly on this. Avoiding big surprises. There'll always be a few surprises at the board table. You can't avoid this, but I think that those heads-ups between the CEO and the chair in particular are quite important. I think it's good practice for SOs who are resource persons to committees to meet with the chair in advance over breakfast and talk about strategy of the meeting and so forth. I think it's key also for directors of education and superintendents to actually answer the questions asked. Trustees are elected officials. And the reason I'm saying it's important to answer questions is I remember, even on our board, sometimes senior team members won't exactly answer the question that's being asked for a governor. And when that happens, I actually don't let the chair call my colleague to order. I do it myself, saying, that's a great answer, but it doesn't answer the question. Because that shows respect for the elected officials and a board as a governance body. Our chair at Laurentian, Michael Atkins, is exceptional at ensuring that every governor, and there are 25 of them, speak up when there's a contentious decision being made. So that, and even if it's only for 30 seconds, because he wants to ensure that when the rubber hits the road, I was going to use another expression, but I realize we're via videotape now, to ensure that everyone's in it together and that someone doesn't, or if there are different point of views that they are known from colleagues at the board table, and to avoid, I knew it, I told you so, and those types of comments from trustees. Now, Chris spoke about consent agenda, and I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that concept. The only organization I've seen a consent agenda is at Universities Canada. I highly recommend it, where essentially all your housekeeping items, minutes, and so forth are just bundled together. I wish we did that as a board of trustees. We probably would have saved an hour and a half at each of our board meetings. And here's a suggestion which I'm not sure every director of education will agree with. I highly recommend a standard item at the end of each board meeting where trustees meet without any staff, including the director of education. Now I hear the rumble, so I'm hearing different perspectives on this. Let me tell you why I think it's important. As a trustee, we had, on avait les réunions, ce qu'on appelle les réunions à huis clos. Les réunions à huis clos, these are in-camera meetings. Et après la réunion, on avait le Perkins Clos. So for those of you who know Ottawa, the Perkins restaurant is a few blocks from the headquarters of the French Catholic Board. So huis clos is in camera, So we would have the huis clos and then the Perkins Clos. And trustees would talk at the restaurant, and I did that, I'm guilty as charged, would talk and share with one another what we didn't have the opportunity to share among ourselves at the board table. I want our governors at the university to leave having said what they wished they would have said at the meeting as opposed to talking about it in the parking lot. And of course, it's the duty of our chair to report back on things I need to know, I need to pay attention to, and so forth. Now, board committees. Il y a 3 exercices annuels à l'Université Laurentienne qui sont, à mon avis, qui sont les conversations les plus utiles pour moi comme recteur d'université. Un des exercices que l'on fait, notre comité de vérification, c'est qu'on amène toute l'équipe exécutive, donc une dizaine de personnes, autour de la table avec notre comité de vérification qui comprend des membres du Conseil des gouverneurs, mais également des membres externes de la communauté. Et on revoit annuellement l'ensemble des risques auxquels l'université fait face, ainsi que les stratégies que l'on met en place pour remédier à ces risques. Et c'est vraiment l'occasion pour moi et pour mon équipe et moi de prendre un recul et amener les gouverneurs à poser les bonnes questions, à savoir est-ce qu'on apporte une attention particulière aux risques importants auxquels l'université fait face. Et à chaque année, les membres du conseil vont identifier des risques qu'on a sous-estimés ou qu'on n'a pas identifiés. La deuxième pratique annuelle, qui est importante à mes yeux comme recteur, c'est l'occasion où non seulement j'ai mon évaluation de rendement à chaque année, mais je partage avec un comité du conseil, environ 4 gouverneurs dans mon cas, les évaluations de rendement de chacun de mes cadres supérieurs. Now, directors of education may think, geez, you're sharing your senior team's performance reviews with a few trustees, that's bringing them in the kitchen. No, they don't make decisions about performance ratings, but they see that I hold my team accountable, and they have a better appreciation of the coaching that I provide for them along the way. And the third exercise that we do annually is around talent management, where to a board committee, I give an update on how we're developing talent for about the top 100 management and senior leader positions within the university. That's something we didn't do in school boards, and I think it's an effective practice that I would encourage you to consider. I also am a big fan of having a few external members on some board committees, especially in audit and in the case of property development and planning. Very few trustees are experts at capital projects. Having people who can provide that level of oversight from a governance perspective at the committee level, I think, is quite valuable. Now, speaking about the board-director relationship, I think that relationship obviously sets the tone for the board, and the way that the director and the chair speak to one another and behave in public sets the tone. I'll give you an example at Laurentian. When I speak about our chair, I always refer to him as the chair. It's not Michael. I'm trying to depersonalize, the issue to show respect for the role. Our chair is exceptional at providing pressure and support, as Michael Fullen will say. So kind of pushing and pushing and pushing in a respectful way for us to be better, but also being very supportive when I need that support as president. I think that's really key for chairs to be supportive in public of the director of education. I think in our case, our chair donated over $500,000 to the university. It could be tempting for him to get in the weeds, but he doesn't. But he's always very supportive of me as president. I also would encourage directors and chairs and boards to have a conversation as to who has the foot on the accelerator and who has the foot on the brakes. If both the board and the director have a foot on the accelerator, that's a recipe for failure. If both have a foot on the brakes, we're going to become mediocre as a school board. I did the same when I was SBO in a school board with our controller in finance and 2 school boards. In one board, I was the guy with the foot on the accelerator. The controller had the foot on the brakes, and another board was actually the opposite as well. I think it's important for directors to flag interference from trustees in the operations. That happened to me only once, thankfully, at the university, where I had to tell our past chair, Floyd Loughran, unfortunately, this governor is getting in the weeds, and it's not the director's role to call that trustee back in line. It's really the role of the chair. I also think it's important to, what I've learned, and I've seen Marc Godbout, a former director in education in Ottawa, do this very well, is to build consensus among elected officials. And one of the tactics he would use is that after a school board election, he would, with the chair, ask each trustee, what are the top 3 things you want to accomplish as a trustee? We know that as trustee, you need to show your constituents that you've delivered the goods, but we also understand you want to be part of a winning team. And that really helped frame how we would manage the board. Because as Tip O'Neill used to say in the States, our politics is local. Now, I want to speak a little bit about the recruitment of the Director of Education and the performance management of the Director of Education. And I'm mindful that we're getting close to lunch, so I'm going to ask a few of you to stand. So I would ask the board chairs to please stand. Just a little stretch break. And if you're a vice chair and the chair's not here, please stand. Okay, so we're going to do a little quiz together. Please remain standing if, for your last CEO recruitment, you used a search firm. If you didn't use a search firm, please sit down. Okay. Please remain standing if in the last 12 months the board did a written performance review of the Director of Education. If it didn't, please sit down. Okay. If you're among the survivors, still standing, was the performance review focused on no more than 5 performance goals that were strategic, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, limited in time? In other words, it wasn't about how to do it, but it was about what to achieve. So if it's the case, please remain standing. Otherwise, please sit down. Okay. Please remain standing if the performance goals of your CEO were shared with the senior team and the principals and parent leaders and teacher federation leaders. Wow, it's getting thin. Please remain standing if your CEO in the last 3 years did a 360 of his leadership. Not that you got the results, but your CEO actually had a 360 that he or she initiated. Otherwise, please sit down. The board had an external firm do a 360 in terms of leadership development. Please remain standing, so the 3 of you, I guess, if your Director of Education is on a 5-year contract or a term contract, as opposed to a permanent appointment. Okay. Please remain standing if you've had a discussion about succession planning in the last 12 months in your board. Well, congratulations to those 3 boards. I guess my message to you this morning is the remaining 69, you have a bit of homework to do, I think. And what I went through are either lessons that I've learned or what I think external observers would consider as effective practices in your board. Now, as much as we've talked about the importance of the board to understand that there's only one employee to the board, and it's the director, I also think it's important for the director to really understand that he or she is the only person accountable to the board. And Tony Dean, the former Secretary of Cabinet here at Queen's Park, used to say, our job as senior executives is to be fearless in providing advice, but loyal in execution. And that's something that I've tried to do as university president. One of the things I did my first few weeks at Laurentian is that our board meetings were filled with reports from vice presidents, VP Academic and VP Research and VP Advancement and Executive Director of Student Life and this and that. We were bringing the governors down the weeds. So I've scrapped all those reports. Now it's one president's report. Everything feeds into it. And it's a report that's aligned with the 5 key goals of the university. One thing I think we need to improve in K-12, and I remember vividly from experience when I was ADM, is I'm not sure we're as good as we could be in confronting the brutal facts. And I'll give you my favorite example. the release of the EQAO results every year. Every school board in the province, without exception, will issue a news release saying either, hooray, our results have improved in at least one discipline versus last year. Hooray, results have improved in at least one discipline in grade 6 versus 3 years ago in grade 3. Hooray, results are at least superior to the provincial average in one discipline. That's usually what would happen. And you may recall that a few years ago, the ministry, in fact, requested school boards in their annual reports to provide the data around the min, the max, the average per group. And the reason this was encouraged because there was a feeling that boards and directors were not confronting the brutal facts. That in some cases, some boards were stalling, were going downwards in their student achievement results, and were not improving. So I think there's some. So one of the things that I ask our board at every meeting is there something I've shared with you where you felt we've got a problem? In other words, being really honest and candid with our Board of Governors. Now, I'm mindful of time, so I'll speak very briefly about strategic planning, because that's obviously one of the key roles of the board, and I will brag a little bit about a strategic plan at the university because it's been highlighted as a model by the Globe and Mail. You see here some of the pictures, including some at Simcoe Muskoka Catholic, and Michael, you'll remember that session when we did the strategic planning exercise in Barrie in 2011. When we developed our strategic plan, I encourage you to go on our website. It's actually 2 pages. And what we tried to do was, I know K-12, much like in universities, you're swamped with data, right? You've got data from EQAO, grade 3, 6, 9, 10, OSSLT, retention, credit accumulation, recruitment, parent satisfaction, student satisfaction, organizational climate. And what we tried to do was to distinguish what were important results that mattered to us, which ones did not matter as much to us, which ones where the results were lower, which ones where the results were higher. And we really tried to narrow our focus around the areas where there were low results and that were of high importance. I think it's important for the board to set the process for strategic planning. It can be tempting for the director to come with a camera-ready strategic planning process. I really think trustees should be driving that process. That's the board's task, to do strategic planning. When we developed our plan at Laurentian, we avoided doing a SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, because that's really demoralizing, right? To say, oh, we're not good at this and that and so forth. So instead, we soared. We talked about the strengths, the opportunities, the aspirations, and the results. And I can guarantee you that all the weaknesses are being articulated in a positive way as an aspiration or a result to be achieved. We actually banned the flip charts. And I'm going to do an infomercial for Queen's, for their decision-making center. I encourage you to use electronic brainstorming, which we did with computers, and where everyone has their say. So everyone feels empowered and being part of the discussion, but it avoids the trustee taking 15 minutes to make his or her point that no one cares about or will not, advance the school board's interest. Là, je vois plusieurs qui se reconnaissent quand je dis ça. Je vous encourage, si votre plan stratégique n'est pas de 2 pages ou moins, ma suggestion, c'est que votre stratégie n'est pas aussi focusée qu'elle pourrait l'être. Fred Stanford, qui est un ancien président de Valley, la plus grosse minière à Sudbury, qui faisait partie de notre conseil des gouverneurs, me disait toujours, Dominic, s'il y a le mot « et » dans une phrase, donc « et » ou « and » en anglais, s'il y a le mot « et » dans une phrase, tu évites de faire un choix stratégique. Alors, littéralement, il effaçait le mot « et » de tout le plan stratégique et il encerclait les verbes. You know how we tend to be really flowery in strategic plans? We're, like a university, we're committed to excellence in research and teaching excellence, research excellence, and holding hands and singing Kumbaya. And to drive a consensus, you'll put all the adjectives you can to please everyone. But ultimately, what matters is the verb. So I really encourage you, as you draft your strategic plan, to circle the verb and really focus on those action verbs. Once our board approved the two-pager as a strategic plan, which had 40 outcomes, measurable for the most part by 2017, we actually came back to the board a few months later with a 6-year budget showing governors what would be the incremental investments per fiscal year for each of the 40 outcomes to ensure the successful implementation of this strategic plan. Another thing that I learned when I was in the ministry, and I saw Suzanne Séguin, formerly from the French language branch in the lobby this morning, when we were struggling with major files in some areas, we were using this model here on the screen that comes from Noster, Villa, and Thousand. That's a framework for thinking about systems change. And I would encourage you as chairs and vice chair and directors, if you feel that the desired change in your board is not happening at the pace you would like, to reflect as to whether the 5 winning conditions for change that are on the slide are present. And it only requires one winning condition to be missing to guarantee that your desired change is not going to materialize. So let's go through this model for a minute. If you're pursuing an agenda on student success, but the vision is not clear, but your team your superintendents and principals and teachers have the right skill set, they have some intense incentives to do better, they've got the resources, and they've got a very robust plan. If the vision is not clear, people will be confused in your school board. If all the winning conditions are there, but the skills are not there, so you've not invested properly in capacity building, people will be anxious. I'm being asked to deliver on something for which I'm not properly equipped as a leader. If the incentives are not there, and that's often the case in K-12 and universities, because we're not in the private sector, the change is going to happen, but it's going to take time. If the resources are not there, people will be frustrated. I'm being asked the impossible. I'm being asked to tackle world peace and world hunger, but I don't have the resources to do the job. And if all the other conditions are there, but the action plan is not thorough and concise and robust, most likely there'll be many false starts along the way. Donc, on parle de planification stratégique. Évidemment, c'est d'opérationnaliser un changement. Encore faut-il savoir où est-ce qu'on veut aller. Ici, sur la diapo, ce que vous avez, c'est une phrase qui dit « How do I tell them I haven't a clue where we're going ?» I'm sure you felt like this a few times as chairs and vice chairs and directors of education. So a few thoughts on strategy. Our Vice President of Administration, Carol McCauley, who's a former Associate Director at Simcoe County and former Controller at St. Clair Catholic, always tells us, show me your budget and I'll tell you what matters to you. As a university in the past, we invested a lot in the faculty complement. Our capital renewal budget was next to zero. Our IT budget was the lowest in our peer group among Ontario universities, so we've had to adjust this over time. The other thing that I've learned is to be purposeful as a board to measure what you value, otherwise you're going to end up valuing what you measure. So as a university, we value and we measure student satisfaction, student engagement, national recognition, average entry grade, student recruitment data, and so forth. As indicated earlier, I really believe that less is more. And I think, as Chris mentioned this morning, it's really the opportunity for you as boards and trustees to asking yourselves the right questions. You know, what do students want or need? Students are the best source of information. My my son who's in grade 6 could probably develop the best strategic plan for his school board. My conversations at bedtime, he'll tell me what he loves about his school, what he doesn't like, what needs to be fixed, and so forth, and same for our students at Laurentian University. Je pense que d'avoir un plan stratégique qui est concis, qui est clair, c'est une expérience qui est libératrice. Lorsque la province nous a demandé, comme université, d'élaborer des ententes stratégiques pluriannuelles il y a quelques années, parce qu'on avait notre plan stratégique clair et concis de 2 pages, ça a été une expérience couronnée de succès. Now, very briefly, because I'm mindful of time, I want to pause for 1 minute and encourage you to have a quick conversation with your chair or with your director. Chris made this point earlier around strategy. I was always surprised when I was ADM in the ministry and we had school board directors or trustees in the MOAD block, and we would bring a minister to a meeting, like minister may come this afternoon. And the conversation very often was about trivial stuff. And I think the best training that an ADM gets in the Ministry of Education, especially when your office is on the 22nd floor and you have to go down the elevator, or go down with the minister on your way to an event, is to practice your elevator pitch, right? Minister, here's what we're trying to achieve with this strategy. Here's what its progress will look like in a year. Here's what we'll know will be successful. And I would really encourage you as directors and chair to have that narrative for your board. And instead of talking, as I've seen directors of education and chairs, commenting about the clothing and the shoes of a minister when she comes in the room, or her hairstyle, I'm serious, happened many times, instead to say, great to see you, minister. I'd love to tell you more about our strategy in our board about X, because a year from now you'll probably hear this, and we hope that we'll be at this level in a measurable way. So maybe over lunch, so I'll give you 30 seconds to rehearse what that pitch would be if the minister came into your table for lunch. 30 seconds as to what you would tell her when she comes in the room. Yep, yep. Give me 5 more and I'm done. Okay, yeah, I just don't show the video. I need to show the video. So, okay. Okay. So thank you. Hopefully this the old good classroom teacher trick, right? So I would encourage you to rehearse this, your 30-second clip for when the minister comes this afternoon. So as I said, before wrapping up with key takeaways, I don't have a book to sell, but I've got a great university to sell. Welcome to the Academic Resort of Ontario. 765 acres surrounded by 5 lakes, a golf course, and a supervised beach. No, we don't own the golf course. We're subject right now of major capital transformation in Sudbury of our university, including a new university club, executive learning center, new labs in forensic science, in occupational health and safety, an Indigenous Sharon Learning Center, and so forth, as well as School of Architecture. Really proud of our areas of strength. So what I'm sharing with you in my next 2 slides is my pitch to my minister, Minister Moridi, if he comes to the university. Proud to be, we're there for students, proud to be #1 in Ontario in post-graduation employment rate, over $100 million in capital projects underway to meet student needs, including new School of Architecture in downtown Sudbury. Canadian University that saw the largest jump in Maclean's rankings since 2009. Our National Research Council funding went up 22% while it remained stagnant nationally. We're now #1 in the country in economic geology research funding, #1 in applied geophysics, #1 in social policy, planning and social prevention, #1 in Ontario in mining and mineral processing. People are talking more about university or the value of our earned media quadrupled since 2010. We're the first university accredited outside the United States for forensic science, the only Canadian business school in Canada to offer a degree in sports administration. And despite the challenging demographics in the north, our admissions are up 15% since 2008, despite teacher education cuts, despite the demographics, and while increasing our average entry grade to 82%. We've opened 2 new schools of medicine and architecture in Canada in the last 40 years. We've completed the largest fundraising campaign in the history of Northern Ontario. We've tripled our number of Indigenous faculty to 24 full-time faculty. We're the first bilingual university designated under Ontario's French Language Services Act. Nous inaugurons plusieurs nouveaux programmes en français, en théâtre, en génie mécanique, génie chimique, génie minier, et à la faculté de gestion. That's my 22-floor elevator pitch to our minister for Laurentian University. So, key takeaways, a few that I hope that you'll retain from this talk. When I look back as a trustee and the chair, I think it's important to be intentional about relationship building, to understand that the coalitions of interest you deal with evolve, to pay attention to orientation for new trustees and new directors, to the PD, to be mindful of the need for quick wins and to stay fresh as leaders, to focus on what matters the next 15 years, to be bold and not plan a budget, to budget a plan, to avoid big surprises, to answer the questions, for chairs to ensure that all the views are heard, and policy is your friend. To value board committee work around risk management and performance reviews and talent management, to be mindful of the need for the director and board relationship to be about pressure and support, and to really think through how to operationalize that unique relationship. C'est important d'avoir un plan stratégique qui est clair, qui est concis, qui mise sur non pas les faiblesses, mais les opportunités, de réfléchir aux 5 conditions gagnantes pour atteindre du changement, de pratiquer votre pitch d'ascenseur pour votre ministre et vos autres partenaires, d'être conscient qu'il y a eu des investissements majeurs en éducation élémentaire secondaire. Malheureusement, à cause du temps, j'ai dû couper quelques diapos, mais vous pourrez le voir lorsqu'ils seront circulés. And of course, the final key takeaway is that Laurentian University is on the move. Now, I want to wrap up by showing you a very short clip from the show Yes, Minister, which I think will wrap up beautifully what governance is about and the challenge you have as elected officials to deliver on positive outcomes for students while being mindful of politics. All politics being local, but also provincial politics. Because at the end of the day, even doing what the public wants is difficult.
He's going to say something new and radical in the broadcast.
What, that silly grand design? Bernard, that was precisely what you had to avoid. How did this come about? I shall need a very good explanation.
Well, he's very keen on it.
What's that got to do with it? Things don't happen just because prime ministers are very keen on them. Neville Chamberlain was very keen on peace.
Yes, he thinks it's a vote winner.
Ah, that's more serious. Sit down. What makes him think that?
Well, the party have had an opinion poll done. It seems all the voters are in favour of bringing back national service.
Well, have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
We can't be for it and
Oh,
against.
of course they can, Bernard. Have you ever been surveyed?
Yes, well, not me, actually, my house. Oh, I see what you mean.
Well, Bernard, you know what happens. Nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously, you want to create a good impression. You don't want to look a fool, do you?
No.
No, so she starts asking you some questions. Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the number of young people without jobs?
Yes.
Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Oh, well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told you can't say no to that. So, they don't mention the first 5 questions, they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those. So, alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result.
How?
Mr. Woolley, are you worried about the danger of war?
Yes.
Are you worried about the growth of armaments?
Yes.
Do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
There you are, you see, Bernard. The perfect balanced sample. So, we just commissioned our own survey for the Ministry of Defense. See to it, Bernard.
Merci beaucoup de votre attention. Je vous remercie à nouveau du privilège de m'avoir invité ce matin. I want to thank you again for your work in advancing publicly funded education in this province. We're very fortunate to have such a strong leadership in the system, and I'm very proud to having spent 15 years in the K-12 system working with many of you. Chimigwech.